So a big thank you to the folks over at My Tax Accountant for helping us put together this discussion today about a really significant development in UK healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. Big one for all of us here in the UK.
And of course, we want to help all of our listeners who are UK taxpayers sort of get a handle on all the facts about this recent announcement from the government regarding NHS England.
Yeah, big changes coming for sure.
Absolutely. So to start, can you just give us a little bit of the background?
Oh, yeah, sure. So NHS England was set up back in 2013,
Okay.
and it's basically the body that runs the NHS in England.
Mm.
So, like how the money is spent, making sure hospitals are meeting targets set by the government, things like that.
So kind of like the administrative heart of the
You
NHS.
got it.
Makes sense. Okay, so the big question then is why is the government getting rid of it? I mean, what's the thinking there?
Well, the government's been talking about cutting down on bureaucracy,
Mm.
all the red tape that slows things down, and they see NHS England as part of the problem.
Too many layers of management, too much paperwork, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Exactly. Too many people checking boxes, not enough people actually, doing the work.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
The Prime Minister's been pretty vocal about it, too, saying that decisions about how all that taxpayer money is spent, we're talking about like 200 billion pounds every year.
Wow.
Yeah. Huge sums of money should be made by people who are directly accountable to the public, not some kind of separate organization.
Okay, so more democratic control, essentially.
Right. And the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Wes Streeting, he's on the same page. He's talked about bringing NHS England back under direct government control. And his argument is that this will actually free up NHS staff to get on with their jobs without being micromanaged.
Yeah, makes sense. Less bureaucracy, more focus on patient care.
Exactly. He's mentioned this Hewitt review, which found that some local services were having to send like 250 reports and forms every month.
You do 50 a month? Are you serious?
Yeah, to NHS England and the Department of Health and Social Care. It's insane.
That's a crazy amount of paperwork. No wonder they're saying there's too much bureaucracy.
Right. And, some people are saying that those 2012 reforms of the health service actually made the bureaucracy worse.
Oh, interesting. So trying to fix a problem created another problem.
Yeah, kind of. So basically, they want to cut waiting lists, make things better for patients, and make sure we're getting the best value for our money as taxpayers.
Okay, so less bureaucracy, more efficiency, better outcomes. That all makes sense. So NHS England is going away, but what's going to happen to all the stuff they were doing?
Well, all those things that NHS England used to do, like running services and deciding how the money is spent, setting priorities along with the government, monitoring how well the NHS is doing, overseeing things like training, gathering data, managing GP services,
Yeah.
all of that is going to be taken over by the Department of Health and Social Care, the DHSC.
Right, so one big central department taking on everything.
Pretty much.
Okay, so how long is this all going to take? I mean, is this going to happen overnight?
No, it's going to be a pretty big change. So they're saying it'll take around 2 years to fully integrate everything.
2 years, that's quite a while.
Yeah, and they've got this special team led by Sir Jim Mackey, who's kind of like the transition CEO at NHS England. They'll be overseeing the whole process. And importantly, they've got 2 clinical directors on the team, one for primary care and one for secondary care. So doctors are involved in the decision-making.
That's good to hear. Makes sense to have doctors involved in something this big.
Yeah, keeps it focused on the patients.
Now, what about the people who work for NHS England and the DHSC? There's been a lot of talk about job losses.
Yeah, there's no way around it. They're planning to cut a lot of jobs, probably about half of the staff across both organizations.
Wow, that's a big reduction.
Yeah, NHS England has around 14,400 employees, and the DHSC has about 3,500. So we're talking about a lot of people.
And that must be causing a lot of worry for the people who work there.
Absolutely. I've heard reports that morale at NHS England is pretty low right now, and understandably so. People are facing the possibility of losing their jobs, their whole lives being turned upside down.
I wonder about the unions. What are they saying about all of this?
Well, Unite, which is one of the big unions representing NHS workers, they've expressed some concerns about the impact of these job cuts. They're worried that it could mean less support for frontline staff like doctors and nurses.
Yeah, if there are fewer people working in administration, that could put more pressure on the people actually delivering the care.
Exactly.
So what's the overall impact going to be for taxpayers?
Well, the government's argument is that this is going to save money in the long run.
Yeah.
Less bureaucracy, less duplication. So in theory, that could mean more money available for frontline services.
Which is what we all want, right?
Yeah. But of course, it's not as simple as that. Just because they're abolishing NHS England doesn't mean our taxes are going to go down.
Right.
And we have to wait and see if these promised savings actually materialize and if it really does lead to shorter waiting times and better care for patients.
Absolutely. We'll be watching closely to see if those improvements actually happen. And what about the NHS as a whole? I mean, what are the potential benefits and drawbacks of this change?
Well, one big concern is the disruption that's likely to happen during this 2-year transition period. Anytime you have a major reorganization like this, it's going to cause some upheaval.
Yeah, things are going to be in flux for a while.
Exactly. And there are also concerns about NHS England losing its operational independence. When it was set up, it was supposed to be at arm's length from the government to avoid political interference. But now it's going to be much more directly under the control of politicians.
And some people are worried about that.
Yeah. The Health Foundation, which is a respected think tank, they've warned that these kinds of reorganizations can be really distracting and take attention away from actually improving patient care.
And what about the staff? What are their biggest worries?
Well, as we said, there's a lot of anxiety about job losses and, the unions are concerned about the impact on frontline services, but there are also broader concerns about morale. A lot of people who work for NHS England are dedicated and they believe in the NHS and they're worried about what all these changes mean for the future of the service.
Right. So it's not just about individual jobs. It's about the bigger picture.
Exactly.
And what about the wider implications for healthcare in the UK?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Will this actually lead to better services, shorter waiting times, improved patient care, or will it just create more chaos and confusion?
And how long will it take to really see the effects of these changes?
It could be years before we know for sure whether this was the right decision.
And have they said anything about whether this will affect the NHS remaining free at the point of use?
Well, the government has been very clear that they're committed to keeping the NHS free, so there's no indication that that's going to change.
That's good to know. That's a fundamental principle of the NHS that people really value.
Absolutely. But yeah, there are still a lot of unanswered questions about how all this is going to work in practice.
Like what?
Well, for starters, we don't know exactly when they're going to introduce the legislation to abolish NHS England. Parliament has to approve it, so that's a big step.
Right.
And we don't know the details of where those job losses are going to fall, which specific roles are going to be cut and which ones will be absorbed into the DHSC.
So a lot of uncertainty for the people working there.
Yeah, and we still need more information about how those integrated care boards and provider trusts are going to make those 50% cuts to their running costs. That's a huge reduction.
That's a lot to figure out in 2 years.
It is, and we also need to know how NHS England and the DHSC are going to work together during this transition period before the abolition is complete.
So a lot of moving parts.
Definitely.
Okay, so to sum up, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, the government is making a big change to how the NHS is run by getting rid of NHS England, and they're doing this to cut down on bureaucracy, give themselves more control over healthcare, and hopefully improve services and make better use of taxpayer money.
But there are also some potential risks.
Yeah, definitely. There's the possibility of disruption during the transition period, concerns about political interference, loss of jobs, and uncertainty for NHS staff.
So it's a bit of a wait-and-see situation.
It is. We'll have to see how it all plays out.
Okay, so for our listeners who want to learn more about this or maybe get some personalized advice about how these changes might affect their taxes or their businesses, who should they contact?
Well, I think the best people to talk to are the folks at My Tax Account. They're the ones who helped us put this discussion together, and they really know their stuff.
They're the experts.
Absolutely.
And to wrap things up, I just want to leave our listeners with a thought. As taxpayers, we all have a stake in the NHS, and these are big changes. So what are you going to be watching most closely in the coming months to see how this all unfolds?
Good question.
It's a conversation that's going to continue for a while, so stay informed, stay engaged, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks again to my tax accountant for making this discussion possible.
Yeah, big thanks to them.